My name is Grzymala-Busse. I am the director of the Europe Center, and it is my great pleasure to introduce my friend, colleague, mentor, and general heroine, Kathryn Stoner, who, Professor Stoner, is the Moscow director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. She is also a senior fellow at SAI, a professor of political science by courtesy, and a senior fellow at Hoover Institution, also by courtesy. She is one of the preeminent experts on contemporary Russia and the politics of the region. She's the author or co-editor of 6 books and numerous articles, book chapters, and op-eds. Most recently, the book Russia Resurrected, Its Power and Purpose in a New Global Order. She was awarded an honorary doctorate from the Iliad State University in Tbilisi, Georgia in 2016. And today, she will discuss the politics and complexities of the recent foreign agents law and its implications for Georgia's future. So we'll go for an hour and we'll take some Q&A. And thanks to Audrey for suggesting all this. So welcome, Kathryn.
Great, thank you. This is almost the whole population of Georgia here in the room. I guess I was hoping to sit down because I have a lot of notes and a funny story to tell you, which is why, and it's a lesson, why you should always read the full email. So this past week I was at my stepdaughter's graduation from business school in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I saw the email exchange going back, and I thought we were just co-sponsoring this talk. And then I realized I'm the speaker. So, so you forced me to actually sit down and look a little bit more closely at the law. And I have, as you mentioned, I had forgotten they'd given me an honorary doctorate from Iliad State University in Tbilisi. And partly the reason for that is I am actually a relatively frequent visitor to Georgia, sort of serendipitously. I have a very good friend who was a summer fellow in our Fisher Family Summer Fellows program, and here at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. And so she has invited us over. Actually, you've been there too, Aisha, under this, right? Under the auspices of her NGO. So a number of us have been talking to her lately because she is being openly harassed as the leader of a non-governmental organization. And she's also been on the streets literally every night with many of our other friends in Georgia for the last 6 weeks, demonstrating against this law. So I actually printed out various interpretations of the law, and we can get into that as well. But I guess I'll just pop up now, and since we can't advance the slides from afar, this will be a little more formal. Okay, so great title that you guys chose, which is Why is Georgia's European Future Uncertain? So this is actually taken from this morning. Today, 84 out of, it's actually 150 members of Georgian Parliament overturned a presidential veto of this law. The foreign agents law will go into effect over the next few weeks, and we'll look at what it means and why we should care about this. Some opposition lawmakers have also joined the demonstrations outside the Georgian Parliament building, and they're yelling things like slaves at the parliamentarians who passed the law and the override today. And who are they slaves to? They're slaves to Russia. Often this is referred to in Georgia as the Russian law as well, because it is based on a 2012 law that was implemented in Russia that essentially gutted civil society in Russia by administrative fiat. Okay, as I said, the law, the veto was overridden this morning. The president, Salome Zurabichvili, and the president of Georgia is really they're technically head of state, but it's that the prime minister's office is where the power is in Georgia. There was a reform in 2013 to the Georgian constitution, which downgraded the role of the president. Actually, Frank Fukuyama and I last year got to meet with the president of Georgia, Salome, as they call her. And she's really a French diplomat. She is Georgian by birth, but she has lived in France and worked as a diplomat most of her life, and just came back in the last 20 or so years to Georgia. And
in what she thought was truly a ceremonial post. She was elected about 4 years ago to this position. And she's had a lot more trouble to deal with than she anticipated in what was supposed to have been a ceremonial role. So as I said, she vetoed the law on May 18th, but this morning the veto was overridden by Parliament, which is dominated by Georgian Dream, and we'll talk about them in a moment. In the last 6 weeks, civil society activists, people who run non-governmental organizations, have been threatened. There's been some violence against them as well. I know several of our friends have received calls from phone numbers they don't recognize, they don't know, and essentially telling them, you know, you better stop demonstrating, we know where you live, and some have even been beaten up. So this is definitely not what we expected at the time of the Rose Revolution in 2003 in Georgia, which we'll discuss. Here we are 21 years later, where not only Georgia's European future is uncertain, but Georgia's democratic future is very uncertain today. And another irony is that we are celebrating now 33 years since Georgia declared its independence from the Soviet Union. It was one of the first republics to do so. So let's just look at freedom, relative freedom in Georgia's neighborhood. And I should ask people in the back row there, Hisham, if you can read that fine print. But let me just tell you, purple, bad, gold, better, green, good, dark green, really good. So if you're dark green in this is just Freedom House from 2023, and 2024 numbers aren't quite out yet, or they might be out any day now. And this is basically the darker green you are. So the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, some question marks this year, I bet. Slovenia, they're all dark green, and they're considered consolidated democracies. Lighter green, that is Poland, Romania, Croatia, Bulgaria. They are semi-consolidated. Gold, and that's our target. Georgia is in that. Here we are here. So here it is, this little wee country. And here is Turkey in here on the Black Sea. But Georgia has access to the Black Sea, as you'll see, and this is Russia coming down here in purple, Ukraine and Moldova. All right, so any color purple is a consolidated authoritarian regime, and there's no light purple really there. So you can see Georgia kind of in the middle. And as I said, one of the earliest former republics of the Soviet Union, then a republic, of course, April 9th, 1991, declared themselves independent of the Soviet Union. Since then, there was a very brief civil war between 1991 and 1993. And it was over two little republics within the country of Georgia. And we're going to talk about them in a second as well. And then just to refresh your memory, because I'm guessing a lot of you aren't Georgian experts, and let me say right off, I am not either. Since from 1993 to 2003, Edward Shevardnadze, and if that name is familiar to you, it's because he was the last, second last foreign minister of the Soviet Union, the guy with the white shock of hair under Gorbachev. He, a Georgian, native Georgian, came down to his home country in 1993, and he is president for 10 years. He is ousted in the Rose Revolution, and here it is, which was one of the first color revolutions, this really the second, Serbia being the first, in 2003. And it was in protest, as you can see here, to corrupt or stolen parliamentary elections. And so that's the ouster of Shevardnadze. It ushers in a new president, Mikhail Saakashvili, who was elected in 2004. And under Saakashvili, Georgia becomes for a time much more open, much more democratic. He undertakes some radical, although slightly kooky reforms at times, But he does a lot to get rid of things like petty corruption. He targets some oligarchs, introduces a lot of transparency into government. And if you go to Tbilisi, which is a beautiful city, probably not a good time to visit just at the moment, but absolutely stunning city. One of their anti-corruption administration is transparent. It's like glass, so you can see all the way through to get the metaphor of glass transparency. And introduced a lot of other sort of checks and balances to, and for the most part, except with a few exceptions, free and fair elections under Saakashvili, but in particular, very successful with anti-corruption reforms. And Georgia, for a time, 2008 to 2013, has a 10% growth rate year on year. You know, doesn't have oil, doesn't have gas. It's a largely agricultural country of 3.75 million people. It does have aspirations to join the European Union and NATO. And a year ago, actually, Georgia was granted candidate status to the European Union, and it has not begun accession talks yet, and probably won't after today, not for a while. In 2008, well, we'll get to it in a second, but in 2008, also in the spring, there was a rather infamous NATO meeting and memorandum that comes out of that, and that is called the Budapest Memorandum, and Bucharest Memorandum, and it says, and it was again George W. Bush's insistence that one day Georgia and Ukraine would join NATO. One day, not today, they would join. This has proven problematic for Ukraine, and it has proven problematic for NATO and one for Georgia. And one of the sort of ironies is Angela Merkel, who was Chancellor of Germany at the time, and Sarkozy, who was president of France, didn't want to openly invite Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, even though these two countries were asking to do so, because they were concerned that this would provoke Russia. The irony, of course, is in not inviting them, definitely probably provoked Russia into invading Ukraine, and as we'll see, has perhaps paved an easy route for Russia into Georgia. Also in 2008, there is a war between Russia and Georgia. And I'll just talk about this very briefly and then get quickly to, because all of this is quite relevant to why there's a foreign agents law now in Georgia. So I mentioned to you that there was, between 1991 and 1993, a civil war in Georgia. And it was really over these two regions here, actually over three of them, but I can't really see on my map very well even to show you, but South Ossetia, well, I can't even see what which is, this is Azara, and the other region that, yeah, let me just see if I can bring it up bigger here. Yeah, it's Abkhazia, but I'm trying to make sure yeah, so Azara, okay, so hang on a second. So Azara, things settle, but Abkhazia and South Ossetia in the top here's Abkhazia, and here's South Ossetia. Things are still highly problematic. And Gamsa Kurdia, who is the president at this time, is in between 91 and until he's ousted in 1993, is very sort of much a Georgian nationalist. And so these republics within Georgia people there feel threatened. So in August of 2004, South Ossetia is trying to sort of separate, and the Georgian government tries to bring them back under their jurisdiction. Abkhazia, we have a similar crisis in 2006, and Azara in the bottom there in 2008. So in this time, Russian forces come in as peacekeeping forces to try and manage these skirmishes. And to make a short war, which is pretty interesting, even shorter here in my remarks, the Georgian military goes in 2008 to assert control in South Ossetia. They are provoked in part by Russia, at least, that's the perspective. And the United States warns the president at the time, and here he is, Saakashvili in 2017. The story of that picture, that's him too in 2023. Saakashvili sends the Georgian military in, and Russia had been conducting military exercises here. And so it turns out they have tanks, and they come through a tunnel here, and there's a relatively big fight, and they take over South Ossetia and also Abkhazia up there in the north. Russia sees really, partly what provokes this is, as I mentioned, the memorandum a few months earlier from NATO saying someday Georgia and Ukraine will join. So this is August, a few months later. So that's one problem. And also, Georgia wants to join the European Union. In other words, if this sounds familiar, Georgia, like Ukraine, is looking west for its future, not east. And that's the problem. The war lasts 5 days, and basically what has happened is that Russia effectively occupies those regions. They've even handed out passports and tried to declare those regions essentially part of Russia. Again, a very familiar playbook played out again in Ukraine a little bit later. Okay, so just pointing out how this all goes here, the lingering effects. Russian occupation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia is basically permanent. Russian sanctions on the Georgian economy, and the end of diplomatic relations until 2012. The new government reinstated diplomatic relations. The sanctions were removed, so trade has started again after 2012, 2013 with Russia. But we have a frozen conflict in Georgia, and Russian troops still occupy Georgian land. You can't go there. I asked. Okay. So what's the story of this picture? This is the former president of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili. He was president until 2013. His party loses in parliamentary elections and that are held in the fall of 2012 to a new party called Georgian Dream. And Saakashvili had, to be honest and fair, some authoritarian tendencies, kind of an odd guy. Although he undertook some very good reforms for Georgia, he, toward the end of his time in office, was increasingly kind of ruling, well, not exactly democratically, and kind of throwing the law at his enemies. When he leaves office in 2013, shortly thereafter, the new government accuses him of various dastardly deeds, including misuse of office. And so he flees Georgia, and in a weird twist of fate, ends up in 2014, 2015 being governor of Odessa in Ukraine under Petro Poroshenko. Then, because Saakashvili can't really get along with a lot of people, has a falling out with Poroshenko. He is stateless because Georgia has stripped him of his citizenship. And now Ukraine has as well. So no one wants him. He wanders around for a few years in Eastern Europe. He comes to the US, and he's US educated. And in 2021, he sneaks back into Georgia, although he kind of announces that he's sneaking in to Georgia. And so surprise, surprise, when you do that, well, the government that has an arrest warrant out for you tends to arrest you. And so that's what they did. And he's in jail for 6 years until 2027. So this is a picture of him last year in 2023. He was quite ill. He's sitting in jail in Tbilisi. And it's unclear exactly what's wrong with him. One theory was COVID. Another theory was hunger strike. But neither of those appeared completely accurate. Maybe he did have COVID at some point. Maybe he was on a hunger strike at some point. But he now sits in a clinic in 2024 in Tbilisi, still a prisoner. And the European Union has actually asked how or whether the current government can let him go get treatment abroad because they don't even know exactly what's wrong with him. Anyway, that's what happens to Saakashvili, the hero of the Rose Revolution. Okay, so who does this to Saakashvili? Well, partly himself, and partly this guy here, who is somebody we don't often see pictures of. This is Bidzina Ivanishvili, and he, after having a falling out with Saakashvili in 2008, and Saakashvili's had fallings out with a lot of people. He comes back to, he comes to politics and he forms this party, announces it in 2011. I put GD here, but it's Georgian Dream. And he's upset with Saakashvili because he thinks Saakashvili ran the 2008 elections corruptly. Now, who is this guy? He's actually quite fascinating. And this is his house / office / kind of, it's almost like Dr. Evil, you know, from Austin Powers. It's kind of, that's sort of what it looks like. He has 3 such facilities in different parts of Georgia. And he's kind of a fascinating guy. He's 68 years old. He's sort of reclusive. You know, apparently have to be escorted in by security guards and you never quite know where he is. He has not 1, but 2 albinos. Again, sort of like Dr. Evil. His wife is apparently albino as well. I only mention this because he mentions it all the time. That his children are albino. And then he has one who's not albino, who's a rapper. Here. Okay, here's the interesting thing about him is that he's worth about $6 billion US, which is about a third of Georgia's annual GDP. So his own net worth is about a third of Georgia's annual GDP. So very, very wealthy guy who has been known to hand out money in health clinics and schools to his home village. He made a lot of his money in the 1990s in Russia. And he went by the name of Boris, and some people say Boris Ivanov, but at least Boris. He went to school in Moscow and he met a business partner there. And basically they were what in Russia we would have called at the time farsovщики. I don't know if anybody knows what that is, but it's like street traders, right? They're the guys who, if anybody went, and actually most people were not born in the 1980s, but if you went in the 1980s to Moscow, you'd be approached by these guys wanting to buy your belt or your jeans. And what they did is resell them, and they're kind of black marketeers is another way of thinking what they did. So they make a fair amount of money doing this. And by the early 90s, apparently they have about $100,000 he and his business partner saved up, which is just a ton of money then. So what do? Well, they create a bank, as a lot of, this is what Khodorkovsky did, formerly Russia's richest man until Putin put him in jail. They create a bank called, I think it's Credit Russia. And that bank, they use its assets and deposits, a little bit like Sam Bankman-Fried, to bring it home to you, to buy up iron ore companies, steel companies, things like that, and also computers. They start actually their first businesses, computers, and there used to be a thing before cell phones, push button telephones, which were like new in the early 90s in Russia. So this is how they make their money. They just like the other sort of big 8 oligarchs in Russia at the time, Berezovsky, Khodorkovsky, Ivanishvili makes his money this way. He leaves Russia, he has Russian citizenship and Georgian citizenship. He leaves in 2003. He goes and lives in France, sells a lot of his businesses, buys expensive art. So he has apparently like original Monets and things like that. But he decides in 2003 to come back to Georgia in the end, and he brings his family back to celebrate the Orange Revolution. So that's his background. People rarely see him, and until recently, a lot of Georgians didn't actually know what he looked like. So he forms Georgian Dream after this falling out with Saakashvili. Saakashvili does not like that. So Saakashvili attempts to strip, and he does strip Ivanishvili of his citizenship for 5 days. Then a law is passed that allows foreigners to run for office in Georgia. And Ivanishvili runs for office. His party wins, not an outright majority, but in a coalition of 6 parties at the time, more seats than Saakashvili's party. And he becomes prime minister, but he had always said that he didn't want to serve that long. So he only serves as prime minister from September 2012, the election, to November 2013. And then he hands off the prime ministership to one of his trusted lieutenants. And this is the current prime minister here with all the hair of Georgia. Sort of interesting cast of characters. Ivanishvili is still, though, very, very involved in Georgian politics, even though he doesn't have day-to-day management. He retains this post of honorary chairman of Georgian Dream, and that allows him to choose the prime minister. Now, he also has chosen other ministers, and he tends to put people he trusts very much into ministerial positions. So, for example, the Minister of Education was apparently, well, now he's not Minister of Education anymore, but one of his ministers of education was his child's math tutor. His bodyguard became the Ministry of the Interior for a while. So some people have described his government as one of thugs, essentially, and one that is based on sort of patronage and personal relationships with Ivanishvili. All right. Ivanishvili's party again wins the elections in 2016, 2020, and the electoral laws change so that more seats are apportioned by proportional representation. And this is important for our story, in October of this year, 2024, there will be elections again in Georgia. So this brings us to the foreign agent law. Why now and what it is. So the idea of a foreign agent law really starts in Russia in 2012. And they are, at the time, the Russian government says it's based on FARA, right? The Foreign Agent Registration Act here in the United States that came into being in 1938, and it was supposed to be aimed at ferreting out Nazi propaganda. Now, it's gone through various contortions. We still have the FARA. However, we also have rule of law and so far, and independent courts for the most part. And so we have due process if you have to register as a foreign agent. Okay. Other countries have adopted laws similar to this, and actually there's been a rash of them in the region around Georgia and Russia. So Hungary has one. I hate to always pick on them, for example. Hungary has one. There are a few Central Asian states that have them. And one of the differences between their version of a foreign agents law and FARA here in the United States is that these are autocracies. And so these foreign agents laws are generally accompanied by enforcement mechanisms like a big Ministry of the Interior and Police. And if they can't afford that or don't want to expand it further, then they allow officials to use their discretion on who is a foreign agent and who is not. And so it tends to become a weapon against political opposition and also against civil society organizations that are devoted to transparency in government, human rights, legal protections. And so this is the hoopla in Georgia. This is what the problem is. Georgian Dream has evolved between 2012 and 2024, as I note there. And so, although Ivanishvili himself and Georgian Dream more generally, have consistently said our goal, when he came into office, he said, my goal is to resurrect positive relations with Russia, including trade, because Russia is huge, as I showed you right next to little Georgia, and resurrect our diplomatic relations with Russia, while at the same time pursuing Georgian membership in the European Union and NATO. So these would seem to be somewhat incompatible goals. But he continued to, and the party continued to make these proclamations. But gradually, things have become less and less open in Georgia. The initial attempt to pass its version of what Georgians on the street are calling the Russian law, but it's I'll get you the full name of it rather than just call it. It's called the Law on Transparency of Foreign Influence. The initial attempt to pass the law was about this time last year in 2023. And there were such large demonstrations on the streets and so much pushback against this that Georgian Dream and its coalition partners stopped with trying to get it through Parliament. They picked up where they left off, though, at basically the end of March of this year, and began the process of moving it through Parliament, slightly changed version of the law, and ultimately passed it in the middle of May. And as I mentioned, the veto of the president was overturned this morning in Georgia. Why now? Well, there are parliamentary elections due in the autumn of 2024. And so that might be one reason. A second reason is that as the war in Ukraine goes on, Georgia has moved more and more under Georgian Dream and Ivanishvili to be sympathetic with Russia. Now, I would say society is split, but elites within the party are less so. And so Ivanishvili even has come out in the last 2 weeks or so, referring to NATO and the European Union as, who opposes this? The global party of war. And he is essentially saying that about his own civil society as well, who is out on the streets. So what does the Georgian law say? Well, it is very similar to the Russian law, but we'll see how it is actually implemented. The Russian law that, as I said, was implemented in 2012, gave so much discretion to officials on the ground in identifying who was and who was not a foreign agent, that it effectively gutted any independent civil society and gradually media as well. The idea is basically to create so many administrative requirements in registering with the Ministry of Justice and in producing financial reports and other reporting requirements that it drives these organizations out of business. They cannot do the work that they're doing. They often have to hire at least 1 or 2 extra administrators to try and keep up with the paperwork. And then in the Russian case, and we'll see if this becomes the case in Georgia, and I suspect it will, in the Russian case and in many other places that have implemented similar laws, on your website, in tweets, these organizations have to say, the New York Times has been declared a foreign agent or is registered as a foreign agent with the Ministry of Justice, and in this case of the Republic of Georgia. The term foreign agent has a very negative connotation in formerly communist countries. It is intended to convey the idea that you are a spy. So every organization, and this will include commercial organizations apparently in the Georgian case, until they actually sort out the implementation, anything that receives 20% or more of its income from outside Georgia is required to register as a foreign agent with the Ministry of Justice. So apparently this can also even be commercial entities. We'll see if that part is actually implemented, but on paper, that's what it says. It can, if you do not do that, if you don't comply, then you're subject to a fine that is the equivalent of about 10,000 US dollars in a country where I think GDP per capita is somewhere around $5,500, $5,800. So a fine for an organization of almost 10,000 US dollars is, as you can tell, a great deal of money, right? And you can face criminal charges. This will definitely apply to media organizations. Any that, for example, get money from USAID or from the European Union, we'll see if they get those that get money from Russia as well. So as of today, that law has been passed. And it will be implemented in the next 30 days. And then there are about 30 to 60 days beyond that for organizations to comply. So why does this matter, and why do it now? Well, partly it has to do with the aspiration to join the European Union. And the European Union has already come out and said, this is antithetical to the spirit of the European Union and to democracy. And they had already told Georgian Dream about a year and a half ago, that you need to de-oligarchize your government. So basically that's code for get rid of Ivanishvili, which got him mad. You need to work on corruption, and you need to treat your minorities better. This basically stops the possibility of accession talks from continuing. The European Union, that will make Russia happy. And it also, I think, will put a halt to aspirations to join NATO. Georgia is a small but relatively important country in some ways. It had been sort of the guidelight of democracy, the North Star in a way, in that region for the last 20 or so years. And what we've seen is going from a situation where Georgians overwhelmingly rejected an affinity with Russia to having a government Georgian Dream that is openly accused of being agents of foreign power themselves. So there's some irony here. And increasingly, it's looking as though Georgia will become a client of Russia. So the prediction is that this is the end of the Rose Revolution, ultimately, that started in 2003, the end of free media and the end of civil society, and the end of a free judiciary over time. And the fear is that Georgia is now just one more former Soviet republic that is now very firmly back in Russia's orbit. So I leave you with the withering rose there. Happy to talk about that.
But a really depressing conclusion.
Yeah.
We'll now open up for Q&A. If anyone has any questions?
Yep.
And as an event, the sanctions are still not there. When do you expect that? Do you expect that they actually will have sanctions are based?
Yeah.
And eventually,
So they have actually. I was just looking to see when. No, it's. So there's, I think actually the U.S. Senate, there's a bill that's about to go through the U.S. Senate. I'm just looking. Targeted, yes. So what are they trying to do? Targeted sanctions against, well, there's within the European Union, there's, as you know, a debate. So Georgian civil society doesn't want visa restrictions on all Georgians going into the European Union because that would hurt them, right? But so what they're trying to get is a list of basically who voted for this law in Parliament and their families. So that seems as though that is going to go through. And I think something similar will come from the United States relatively shortly as well, because I know that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee has been discussing this. So I think now that this has happened, it's a shame that it didn't happen sooner to forestall them doing this. But it seems as though they will, happen shortly. Whether that actually has any effect on Georgian Dream, I mean, you will know better. Abroad. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah, he's a crazy guy. But yeah, so my understanding is actually that the Senate is I was just looking to see whether I wrote this down or not anywhere, but the Senate is actually working on this now, and apparently the law that there's some surprise that it's Georgia, and the name Ivanishvili has been mentioned so many times in the US Senate. I'm pretty sure they can't pronounce it. But you know, presumably he will personally be targeted where he keeps his money. Who knows? He probably doesn't keep it in Georgia, but the US financial system is pretty, you know, our control over it is pretty extensive. So between the US and the EU, but yeah.
Hello, everyone. My name is Asad. I'm from Kazakhstan, from Space and Digital Ministry. I'm advisor of Ministry of Space and Digital. First of all, thank you for your interesting performance. I studied, it's my long-term hobby to study reforms. I studied reforms in Georgia. Then I went in Ukraine to meet with Mikhail teams. I meet with Georgi Tsakaya, if you know, then Prime Minister of Adjaria
Region Azara. Yeah.
Then I invite his team in Kazakhstan with some research our problems. And my question: is it possible to carry out Georgian reforms in other country of the Soviet Union?
The former Soviet Union, Georgian reforms, as in the reforms that Saakashvili undertook.
Yes.
I guess under the right leadership. I think I don't think there's a cultural allergy anywhere to carrying out corruption reforms. It's whether there is an incentive for leaders to do it, right? And to create institutions and decide that they will respect rule of law as opposed to the rule of a person. And that's exactly what has happened in Georgia, is that it's now the rule of a person as opposed to rule of law, right? And so they're going to go right backwards. So I don't think there's a reason not to. I don't accept cultural determinism as an argument. I mean, we used to say that, you know, before the Second World War, then Japan and Germany are just incapable of democracy, and well, it turns out that they weren't, right? So I think that it's generally true of everywhere, but you know, you need leaders who decide that they have a public interest at heart when they come into office, not their own private interest. And unfortunately, in many post-Soviet republics, countries that had been part of the Soviet Union, you don't have that. And this is also what has happened in Georgia.
Hi, I'm Talia. I'm a history and Russian studies double major at Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. Actually, just recently spent some time abroad in Almaty. Yeah, I'm just kidding. But I was kind of just wondering, and forgive me if it's something you explained that I didn't hear it. Apart from this kind of Euroscepticism that is characterizing Georgian Dream, what kind of policies would they carry out that kind of could account for their rise to dominate the Georgian?
So great question, and I didn't actually talk about it, but so it's been gradual. There are a couple of factors that, first of all, people were tired of Saakashvili in 2012, right? So they didn't win like a huge majority, but they got, I'm trying to find where I wrote down all of the numbers to get them right. But they got enough to get rid of Saakashvili, 47 out of 150 votes just to seats just to Georgian Dream, and then they go into a coalition. Coalition gradually falls apart. So they win in 2012, 54% of the vote goes to the coalition, 40% to Saakashvili's coalition of parties. I think that's fatigue with Saakashvili, and one of the things that also, despite the sort of picture of reform and package of reform that Saakashvili undertakes to get rid of things like petty corruption and to bring growth back to Georgia. There is, right before these elections, a video that is released of prisoners in Georgian prisons being treated, just to be polite, very badly. And that happens to be shown on a number of television stations, including one owned by Ivanishvili. So, I think that helps, right? And then they have the power of incumbency after that. And then they have growth. And it looks like high growth, but it's a very poor country and pretty unequal. So, and then one aspect of incumbency is being able to change the rules to make them suit you better. So there used to be a 5% barrier to getting into parliament. Now it's a 1% barrier. Why does that matter? It matters ultimately on the calculation of other parties that get in with whom you can make coalition partners. So I think that's largely it. And then there hasn't been a lot of Euroscepticism rhetoric. They've said that they want to join the European Union. They want to join accession talks. They want to join NATO, but they also want to repair relations with Russia. So they haven't actually, challenged this. And the answer here, I think, will be, well, it's the European Union that is interfering with our internal affairs by telling us now we can't start accession talks, when obviously they knew very well that the European Union wouldn't approve of what they're doing, and were warned again and again and again not to do this.
Okay, the gentleman, I think.
Yeah, my name is Vidas, Professor of Innovation in the Georgia last millennium. I haven't been this millennium, but I was wondering if, what is population really supporting right now? When last parliamentary elections, are there any allegations, that they were unfair elections, or really it represents, the voice of people? So per se, and is geographically any distribution, that some regions support more, these pro-Russian, kind of thing, versus, versus pro-European stance. And the third part of that question is, do Russian business interests, especially this time, when Russians are under economic sanctions, and right now I believe that there are some probably businesses, joint ventures, and so on that are doing, business for Russia, from Georgia. Do they really also play a role in forming, public opinion for Russia, but against Russia?
Yeah. So there are questions about how many people support this. So Georgian Dream, the number I saw most recently was Georgian Dream claims 60% of the population support the Foreign Agents Law. They don't produce any data. They just say that. So we don't know if that's true. It's hard to get, 100,000 people on the streets every night in Tbilisi for 6 weeks. And it's a country of 4 million. So what is that? Like 4% of the, I can't do the math that fast in my head, but that's actually a significant percentage of the population that's out on the streets demonstrating. So if you're out demonstrating, you feel something really strongly, right? So, I think there's an open question. People were very unhappy about the number of Russians coming into the country who were fleeing the war. And this may be kind of another reason why Putin's government in Russia would like to get better control over Georgia, so it doesn't become any sort of haven for what he thinks of as criminal. He's called them scum, those who are leaving his own country because of the war. In terms of free and fair elections, I think it's safe to say, and I would ask our Georgian friends here, they have become less free and less fair over time. So what was true in 2012 became less true by 2020 in terms of who could run, how much money was being put in to campaigns, who could appear on television, that sort of thing. I would guess the reason that they have adopted this law is to make that even more unfair, right? So, Putin will say, well, I won 87.2% of the vote in Russia in March in the presidential elections with a 77% turnout. Well, first of all, that's, certain proportions, probably outright fraud, right? And second, there's no alternative because you don't allow it, right? And there's nobody else who appears in the media because you don't allow it. And so I think there's a shade of that that you could say is true in Georgia as well. In terms of businesses, well, I think it depends on what sector you're talking about, right? So some benefit a great deal from trading more with Russia, others less so. For example, the wine industry, the Georgian wine industry, did a great deal to when there was not trade between Georgia and Russia. They used to sell a lot of Georgian wine into Russia. You probably had it in Lithuania too, maybe. Yeah, but it doesn't. So it's fermented in clay pots in the ground. Did you know this? Yes, you did. Right. Okay. How many times have I told you? Okay. And it makes it quite distinctive flavor, right? But it is not friendly to the European or North American palate. And so the Georgians had to find a market for it. And so they started creating versions that were friendlier to the European or North American palate. And so, joined that market so they wouldn't be so dependent on Russia. So the wine industry maybe doesn't, worry as much. So I think sectorally it makes a difference. Georgians, though, are by and large, ethnic Georgians are quite nationalistic, and their language is not anywhere near Russian. It is not a Slavic language. They do not share Russian Orthodoxy as a religion. People who are your age don't speak Russian, don't want to speak Russian, and don't want to watch Russian television. So, very much wanting to be independent. So unfortunately, I think it means a lot more conflict. I mean, you can probably speak to this, Georgians in the room, even more about what they think is going to happen. So I think it's probably a pretty small sector that is saying, yeah, let's join up with Russia and be dominated.
Go ahead.
Old people. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there are different theories. One is where exactly Ivanishvili's money is. Some of it might be in Russia or controllable by Russia, or maybe he's been promised something by Russia. That's one possibility. Second is being maybe there's some sort of secret deal with Russia and Georgian Dream if they turn policy this way. I mean, essentially, this is what he was trying to get Yanukovych to do in Ukraine. It's a very similar scenario, right? So you have what Putin really doesn't like, these color revolutions. Really does not like those, and he doesn't like a turn to the west of any former Soviet republic, because that's Russia's historical sphere of influence to his way of thinking. So Georgia, even though all of the things that are different I just told you, right, it's not Ukraine, because his argument for Ukraine is we are basically the same. Can't make that argument about Georgia, but he's basically making that argument, right? And what it is, is ensuring that it doesn't go like Ukraine, where Yanukovych basically, doesn't take Russia's deal and instead flees Ukraine, and you have Maidan. So I think the incentive in Georgia is probably money, and that people who are in Georgian Dream and who are close and attached to Ivanishvili can make money in Russia, and they don't see that they can make as much by having to follow rules and be transparent if Georgia joins the European Union.
Okay, one question here, one question here.
Basically, that brings elections probably the expectation that
I think it's pretty low right now. Well, I mean, it already is going to be low if organizations that in 2012 were very useful in actually providing information about Georgian Dream, about the coalition, that were civil society organizations. In 2024, organizations like that will be registered as foreign agents because they all took money from USAID and the European Union. So, and then medias, I would expect there'd be a lot of media shut down or highly restricted by the time the elections roll around, because they will have to declare that they're foreign agents as well.
And the final question goes to Ukraine.
Thank you, Kathryn. Thank you. Conversation section. I would like to go back to more of the countries that were arena. The failure of the 3Ds, the democratization, the occupation, that was also inspired by Saakashvili team, that was later seen as the example by some of the other countries that actually showed that at least attempted to have a very profound influence in Ukraine. All of this, of course, at least an inspiration for Georgians. It gives them insights, it gives them strength to fight for tomorrow, and I'm confident that the passion that Georgian society has for democracy, because we see that there are Georgians that in Ukraine. There are Georgians who are rallying outside of Georgia and who are willing to bring as much democracy as possible and transparency to their country. Now the question is to not let that down. And of course, we understand outside of the country that it's important to separate the government with all of its losses and with all of its the course to go back to Russian scheme and to Russian pattern, but how to inspire Georgians, how to prove that democracy exists, and has the rights to live and be strong in Georgia, and how to not let their hopes down, because I think that with the most recent shuttle diplomacy that the EU has been trying to do before the passing of the law, so that it was unsuccessful. Ivanishvili is referring that they're not afraid of the US sanctions. What to do? What to do next?
Well, I think you're going to see it. So I wouldn't say that the shuttle diplomacy was a failure. I know just from being in communication with friends of mine in Georgia who work in different non-governmental organizations, or in fact for foreign governments there, that they got more than they had expected. They were really down 2 or 3 weeks ago, and so actually I think that they've been surprised and somewhat cheered by the very strong statements. They are watching for targeted sanctions on individuals and their families, and so that will affect some more than others. These things take time. They're ultimately what will save Georgia and what will save Ukraine is the fact that they are not Russia. They have very, very active civil societies. People are pretty fearless. And the Georgians have a pretty long history, as the Ukrainians do, of, really actually when institutions fail them, holding leaders accountable by going out on the streets. And so I do think you're going to see a sort of a summer of mobilization in Georgia. Unfortunately, I think you're going to see some violence too. I think this is actually quite dangerous for Ivanishvili unless, he's really willing to shoot a lot of people. And I hope that's not the case. So far, it's just rubber bullets.
Well, not even more cheerful.
I know, yeah, right, exactly. Sorry about that.
Thank you so much, Catherine.
Oh,
This was great.
Thank
everyone.
you.